Hello and welcome to One on One. I'm Vernon Ramos, and I'm very pleased to say my guest today is Wesley Gibbings, freelance journalist, editorial consultant for Insight magazine in Guyana. He's covered elections throughout the region and, of course, around the world as well, and advised media houses around the world on election coverage. Welcome, Wesley, and I should also mention part of the family as well.
Yes, exactly.
Just to be perfectly fair and truthful to everybody. Well, we've got elections taking place in this country not too far from now, presumably.
Yes.
But right now we've got an post-election situation in Guyana. Knowing Trinidad, we don't really care too much what's happening outside of our borders, but it's an interesting story for the region, isn't it?
Yes, it's a very, very interesting story for the region and particularly for people in Trinidad and Tobago. I always contend that a Guyana story is a Trinidad and Tobago story.
Because ethnically, actually, the two places are very similarly made up.
It's similar, but it would be a mistake to say that it's the same, and it's also a mistake to suggest that the leading parties there are approximately the same. They are not. It's the dynamic.
That would be a misconception on the parts of people.
It would be a misconception. People tend to do it very loosely, but there are all kinds of political and social and cultural antecedents that are completely different to our situation here. Chief among which would be the current electoral system. So people who are seeing the election race in Guyana and are asking questions about the delay in getting results out and so on.
Based on what we know here.
Yeah, based on what we know here, we'll get it all wrong and we'll go about with the wrong impression.
And of course, Guyana, as part of the English-speaking Caribbean, is also a little unique as well in that its political structure is somewhat different.
Yes.
Trinidad and Tobago and most of the English-speaking Caribbean.
Yes, of course.
We've got an executive president.
Yes, they have an executive president as a unicameral legislature. They have a system of proportional representation. That's unique in its own way because, just next door you have Suriname, which also has proportional representation. But their system is a district representation system. So people are elected on the basis of proportional representation in the various electoral districts, and those representatives now go on to become members of parliament. In Guyana, you have two systems. You have a national list system, which would account for 40 of the 65 seats in the parliament. And you have a regional representative system, which accounts for the other 25.
So you've got basically two elections going on at once.
It's essentially two elections. In fact, on the ballot paper, you vote twice. Because there's an electoral list for the national vote, and there's a separate electoral list for the regional vote. Now, on the basis of proportional representation, let us say you have one region or district that carries with it 3 parliamentary seats. If you have people going to the vote, they would elect those 3 representatives on the basis of proportional representation for the districts, but at the same time they cast a vote for the party that they prefer. Technically, it is a presidential election. You can look at it that way, that the national component is presidential in that you vote for who you think should be the president. Technically, it's not so represented in that way in the ballot paper. The parties are represented.
It's not like the US where you go in and you vote for Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or whoever.
No,
right?
but for all intents and purposes, you are voting for a slate that includes a presidential candidate and a prime ministerial candidate.
So you know what you're getting as
you know
vote.
what you're getting in advance.
So the 2 of those votes combined to create the chamber, the lone chamber that they have,
yes,
which represents their parliament.
65 seats.
It's also interesting as well in that coalition is once again coming into play in Guyana,
yes,
as it has here.
Yes,
what's the situation there, and what brought that about?
Well, what stimulated it, we go back to the electoral system again, because in the election of 2011, the ruling party, the PPPC, they got 32 seats in the 65 member chamber. The combined opposition got 33 seats. Now, under their constitution, what counts is the plurality. It's the party that commands the most amount of seats on its own. So it is entirely possible
you can't, after the fact, go and say, listen, we're joining with.
No, you can't. Okay. So you can act, a minority government is a possibility under their constitution.
But that's in fact what they got.
And that's what they got, which meant for the ruling party a high degree of difficulty in terms of getting legislation passed in Parliament. They were unable to successfully pass national budgets. Every budget that was brought before them was struck down. The office of the president, for example, there are line budgets that were reduced to 0 by the opposition, and the opposition in turn proposed their own budgets for their own heads of expenditure, which are of course rejected, and so it did not make for a very good situation.
So how was Guyana even functioning over the last few years then?
Well, it was some suggest that it was functioning to some extent illegally with respect to expenditure of state funds, because in order to spend state funds, you need to have parliamentary approval for a lot of it, sizable chunks of it, but the government was spending money anyway. I can give one example where the combined opposition opposed the budget in the presidential and the office of the president for the government information services. They reduced the budget to 1 cent, I think it was, 1 Guyana cent.
Not even a Trini cent.
Not even a Trini cent. And, but the government information continued to function. In fact, they even hired consultants and they expanded and they went about their business. So for all intents and purposes, and it was challenged in court, which brings into question the state of the judiciary, which is going to be very critical in the next few days as they move to install a new administration should the final declaration show that the opposition have in fact received a majority vote.
And then to the average Trini, that would seem like a very dysfunctional system operating in the last few years. Does it seem that way to Guyanese as well?
Yes, it has seemed to be very dysfunctional, but the thing is that it's a highly partisan environment. So there would be one group of people who would see absolutely nothing wrong with not receiving a parliamentary approval for certain heads of expenditure, and there would be another group of people who would think that's absolutely wrong and it's something that's going to tear apart your society and something that was absolutely detrimental to the society.
Now, I've only been to Guyana for one election, but it seemed to me there's a tremendous polarity within the society there, and there's strong forces trying to pull the country apart, it seems to me.
Yes.
I'd only been there for a short time, and I was already feeling that. Is there, as there is in Trinidad, a large undecided voter bloc, a floating bloc, if you will?
Well, that constituency has expressed itself in terms of a third bloc. Now, people started recognizing that phenomenon back in the election of 2006, I think it was, with the emergence of the Alliance for Change, which emerged as a relatively strong third force in the political scene. Prior to the AFC, of course, you did have the Working People's Alliance under Walter Rodney, which played a role in terms of establishing a kind of third space for, an alternative space for political expression. Well, the AFC, in my view, adopted that kind of role. Some people describe the AFC in the same terms that they describe the COP in Trinidad, approximately. It's, of course, not the same dynamic, but it's something like a third space where people can dialogue about politics, and you had the usual, virtually the same platitudes about changing the political culture and the new politics and that kind of thing. Because it crossed ethnic lines, cross-class lines, it was not ideological, beholden, such as the other two parties which have come basically from socialist moorings. So it more represented a kind of progressive, more modern kind of element in the society. Now the AFC, people should know, have now teamed up with the Alliance, a Partnership for National Unity, which essentially is the People's National Congress wearing a different hat or suit. And that issue became a campaign issue throughout the campaign from the PPP benches, because they're saying, if you're so proud of your legacy as a political organization, why seek to change your name? But at the same time, you need to bear in mind that the PNC itself had changed considerably over the years. And there are clear transition periods. For example, the death of Burnham and the emergence of Desmond Hoyt marked a significant change in terms of the ideological slant of the PNC and the direction in which they were attempting to lead the country. In fact, it has been determined that in terms of the economic fortunes of the country, there was a significant upturn when the Desmond Hoyt administration came into play, much more pragmatic, much more open to alternative expressions and so on. And of course, the Burnham days were marked by a considerable amount of oppression and so on,
and controversy.
That eased considerably.
So basically what we have there is, I'm not saying there's any connection between the two at all, but it's like we have what we consider the old PNM and the new PNM, but they actually changed the name of the party to reflect that change in philosophy.
Yeah, well, in theory, it was supposed to signify a sort of alliance with other political forces. But of course, the PPP did the same thing. You see reference to the PPP civic. Now, the civic element that was added to PPP was supposed to represent civil society organizations and interest groups. Likewise, a Partnership for National Unity was meant to signify an association of the PNC with the Working People's Alliance and with civil society organizations, and hence the name.
So we can go
Partnership for National
back to the
Unity.
UNCA in Trinidad and Tobago at one stage.
Or you might even want to say People's Partnership.
Of course, as well.
So, which of course still considers itself to be a constituted of various independent political organizations. But the APNU, basically the WPA has submerged itself in that, and the organizations that have associated themselves with APNU have basically subsumed their identities under the banner. Even though for the purposes of this election, Rupert Rupnarine, who heads WPA, emerged in his own right as a spokesperson on behalf of the alliance.
Now, to me, you're like the Triniest of all Trinis.
Yes.
But you have lived in Guyana.
Yes.
To any extent, do they actually look to us for political examples, or are we just being...
Oh, yes, they do. Yes, they do. And I would say that, the most recent developments with respect to the handling of misbehavior, or however you want to describe it, in the cabinet, for example, was looked upon most favorably. And people were saying in Guyana that, if they had a president or head of state or head of government who was as decisive as the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago has been with respect to whipping her charges into shape, then they would have had a different kind of Guyana and a different kind of government. So they look at to Trinidad and Tobago for a lot of things. They look to Trinidad and Tobago with respect to, you spoke about the third force, or the 32%, whatever you described, the so-called undecideds. To say, well, look, we can also be a society in which people tear themselves away from all these sort of the legacies of the past, ideological, ethnic, and so on. The ideological component is a lot stronger than we sometimes tend to give it credit for. Guyana is probably the only, well, perhaps Suriname might be to some extent, within CARICOM, that operates a secular state in the true sense of the word. Secularism is very prominent. They pay regard to civic as opposed to theocratic virtues and mores and so on. I mean, that's a different discussion. But it's what's remarkable is that they attempt essentially to run an entirely secular society. Of course, that would probably
do
go
they have
back
their
to the
parliamentary
socialists.
prayer and things as well, or have they discussed that?
I can't recall if there is a parliamentary prayer, but the prayers and so don't really feature very highly in their public.
Well, that makes it sort of interesting, as you mentioned. In terms of the ethnic component to voting in Guyana, I know there's certainly one in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yes.
Is there something similar in Guyana?
Yes, it's similar. I mean, very roughly, one can say that the Indians tend to support the PPP, and the Africans tend to support the PNC, now APNU. But that has changed over the years, because very much like Trinidad and Tobago, people are growing out of the past in which that you had this sharp polarization. Now, ethnic conflict in Guyana came to a head, a very violent head, back in the 1960s. The current government has been in power since 1992. The vast majority of people who are voting now were not around in the 60s, and many of them, significant block of them, weren't around, can't remember before 1992. You had a high number, I can't remember the statistic, but you had a high number of first-time voters this time around. Between 2011 and 2015, I mean, I can't remember the statistic, but there's a significant number of people who have been voting for the very first time. Which means that the legacy of 1966, which led to conflict and violence and people being attacked, and even later on when you had the elections, the troublesome elections that followed the change of government in 92, 97 and so on, a lot of people weren't really politically aware. I mean, they hear stories, and I suppose at home, young people are hearing, back in the 60s, these people were killing and raping and looting or whatever. But it's not a recent memory to a lot of them. So there
Or
is
isn't a memory at all,
emerging-
it's a handed down memory.
Yeah, it's a handed down memory. It's not a first-hand memory at all. So,
And I guess to a large extent, modern Guyana is shaped by those difficult years under Burnham as well, isn't it?
yeah,
But has it fully recovered politically?
no, because there are a lot of legacies. The Constitution is one legacy, for example, because the Constitution was designed essentially to ensure that the incumbent remained in power. Now, the PPP had campaigned for many years to reform the Constitution so that the government that emerges would be more representative. For example, the 32-33 dichotomy that occurred after 2011, one would have envisaged that if the PPP had kept its promise to reform the Constitution, then and to allow the quote-unquote voice of the people to be heard vis-a-vis elections and parliamentary representation, then the constitutional arrangements would have made it possible for the parties that control the majority, which would have been 33, to have run the government. So, clearly the legacy continues, but the legacy is supported in a sense by the status quo. There are people who have a vested interest in ensuring that there isn't that kind of constitutional change. The other thing about it, and which is very relevant to the events of the past few days, is the fact that the electoral laws and regulations, have not been changed since the 90s, since the 92 election, which is considered to have been the first free and fair elections since the elections of the 60s in Guyana. Within that time, technology, for example, has changed, so that the current regulation that speaks to the issue of the receipt of statements of poll for the results dictate that information cannot be relayed electronically.
Or specifically prescribed that you can't relay electronically?
No, it is prescribed the other way, which is that
it must be in hand.
It must be in your hand.
Right.
Physically.
Now, Guyana is a huge place.
It's a huge, 83,000 square miles if you want to.
With very poor infrastructure in the interior.
Right, very poor infrastructure. The electoral system is also such that, people are asking why weren't the results declared when the trend dictated one way. What happens in proportional representation is that your country essentially becomes one constituency. For the electoral authorities to start declaring results as you go along, depending on where those votes are coming from that have been counted, people can be completely misled as to what the eventual outcome is.
Because there's a formula that they use based on the figures.
It's a formula
It's not like us here in the media in 2010 sitting down and declaring the election called after 2 hours.
Yeah, which is possible because per constituency, it's first past the post.
Right.
So if you have 20,000 votes and a party has already reached 11,000, you can declare.
Quietly, yeah.
But in their case, the formula is based on the totality of the votes. And then you use a quota method, here formula, which I hear people talking about all the time here, which is a simple arithmetic, don't ask me to get into the details of it. But it's based on the totality of the vote. So it's impossible practically, even though you can say, well, one party has received 270,000 and the other party has received 260,000, so it looks. No, but what you are not considering...
But is that responsible reporting at that point?
It would not be responsible. Right. So that yesterday, for example, there were journalists who had received press releases from the two parties, both of whom were claiming victory on the basis of figures that they presented. And it was a real challenge now, well, how do you report on that? And for that reason, I've been associated with the training of journalists there for elections for the past 10 years. We have had no fewer than 4 major training. Many journalists, it's like here,
Big
turnover. We know, yeah. Don't worry, we've done this before, don't worry. And you keep telling them that covering an election is not just your ability to record what was said on the platforms or how you interpret the manifestos and these things. It's understanding what the processes are, what do the laws say. In Guyana, you need to understand what the Constitution says, you need to understand what the Representation of the People Act says, and what you need to understand what the electoral regulations say. And it's very specific and it's very well defined, because when they underwent the reform process in '92, which led to a regularization of elections, they received a tremendous amount of international support for the development of a process that was as free from interference and irregularity as humanly possible.
I suppose in terms of media coverage, Guyana for a very long time did not have a completely free media, it's fair to say. So they must have had a challenge in that, in terms of retraining themselves to be a free media.
Absolutely. Now, the thing is that unlike the configuration of Guyanese media is unlike here. You do have state media, but state media include newspaper. One of the oldest newspaper is owned and controlled by the state, but has been routinely used by parties in power as their political
Such a thing has never happened here, so I don't understand.
No, we have never had that in the newspaper business. And Guyana has a newspaper tradition, unlike many countries in CARICOM. Most of the countries in CARICOM have more broadcast media environments than newspaper environments. It's only recently countries like Antigua and St. Lucia have had, well, St. Lucia still don't have a daily newspaper, but only recently some of them have moved into daily newspapers. By and large, you're talking about broadcasts, but Guyana has a strong newspaper tradition. So how the newspapers operate and how they function in the society is important. Then the political party, the PPP has a newspaper, a long-standing newspaper. One of its editors was Janet Jagan. One of its editors is Moses Nagamutu, who is now the prime ministerial candidate for the APNU AFC. One of their reporters is Clement Rohi, who is now Minister of Home Affairs and on the PPP list. One of its editorial assistants is Gail Teixeira, who is one of the ministers in the current government that's on the way out. So the entrenchment of quote-unquote media into the politics and how things work and so on is very important. And the dynamic is completely different from here. So when you talk to Guyanese journalists, it's sort of a different ball game. And what you rely on really are what are the fundamental and the core journalistic principles. And it comes right back to the basics of being fair, being balanced, and being professional.
And hoping that there's no interference after you leave from the training into the work of journalists, into how they report. It's interesting, as we mentioned, the parallels between Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana, and we have about 4 minutes left. We've had a string of no-confidence votes here in Trinidad and Tobago. Guyana, of course, had their own interesting attempt at a no-confidence vote, which resulted in the suspension of Parliament.
Of course, yes.
Which surprised everyone, but also did not surprise a lot of people as well.
Yeah, which draws similarities to elsewhere in the region. You see, Trinidadians need to pay attention to the region more carefully, because the vote of no confidence issue was very topical in St. Kitts. And that attempted vote of no confidence against the Prime Minister led to the chain of circumstances that have now led to his ouster. So it seems as we sit here. Also under conditions of a coalition, because it's team unity in St. Kitts. Now the situation in Guyana, it's an alliance/coalition arrangement. If you look at Suriname, which is going to the polls on the 25th of this month, it's a coalition. In fact, their constitution is framed in such a way you always have coalition. So all of these key words, key political words and terms that Trinidadians are now starting to explore. Some countries
as if we invented
crossed
them.
that path long before the whole motion of no confidence issue.
No, I should have asked you this earlier, but in terms of the coalition in Guyana, was it like here that they would have agreed who ran in what area? Is that?
No, well, they don't have a constituency system. What was the main point of contention is who would be the presidential candidate and who would be the prime ministerial candidate.
No, but based on what we can't really predict completely, but it seems that there's going to be a bit of a sea change in Guyana. What do you think that'll mean in terms of the ship of state sailing on?
Yeah, I think once there is not a deliberate attempt at disrupting the process,
which is never certain in Guyana,
which is not certain, and I think that the challenge to the existing situation right now by the ruling party, normally in a situation where you have a very close marginal situation, it's the opposition who's complaining and talking about irregularities and the government engineered things in such a way for you to lose. It's happening the other way this time, because none of the official objections right now have come from the opposition, which seems to be in front. Now, you pay very close attention to the role of the judiciary over the next few days. The swearing
Do you think
process.
it'll reach that stage? It may have to.
Well, there are different things that are in place. I think that the ruling party might be considering some kind of legal intervention. The chancellor of the court is the person who will have to conduct the swearing in. Try to remember what happened in St. Kitts. Where the new Prime Minister was almost not sworn in by the Governor General, who is the one responsible for that. So there are a lot of red flags to negotiate and to keep an eye on between now and when the final election results are.
I guess we can all only hope for a peaceful transition in Guyana, and that Guyana continues to go from strength to strength in terms of democracy.
Yes.
Wesley, it's always a great pleasure to have you on the program, and always nice to see you at family functions as well.
Same here,
I guess I owe you 2 dozen oysters apparently for
yes, you
being
do.
here.
You do. I'm going to tip.
I formalized it here.
All right.
Thanks so much, Wesley.
All
All the best. Thank you very much. You've been watching One on One. Join us again tomorrow for another edition.